tell us about emergence and breakdown of the memory picture in Brownian models. So take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak. It's very nice to be back here. So today I'm going to be talking about some work in progress with Sanjay Muthalia, who is a group leader in condensed matter at TU Munich, and Tibor Rakovsky, who is a postdoc at Stanford in condensed matter. Okay, so let me start with some background and motivations for this work. So the general setup that we have in mind is some chaotic quantum many-body system. And in the time evolution of such systems, we expect quite universally to see certain generic behaviors. So one example of this is the process of equilibration, where suppose we start with some pure state psi in such a system, then at late times we expect that the details of the initial state is forgotten, and the state resembles some kind of thermal density matrix rho equilibrium. And this is reflected in operator expectation values. For instance, if we look at the expectation value of some few-body observable O in the time evolved pure state, that should be close to the value in the equilibrium density matrix. And the equilibration is also reflected in information theoretic quantities. For instance, if we look at the late time value of the M20 entropy, then that is given by this. So if we're looking at some subsystem A, then the M20 entropy in the time evolved pure state should be given by the minimization of the M20 entropy of the equilibrium density matrix between A and A bar. Okay. But in both correlation functions and information theoretic quantities, we expect to find some universal behavior not only in the equilibrium value, but also in the way that the equilibrium value is approached. And the universality of the approach to equilibrium for correlation functions is well understood in terms of some universal hybridynamic modes in systems which have conserved quantities. In systems without conserved quantities, we expect that there is just some simple exponential decay. The goal in this talk will be to identify a similar set of low-lying modes which underlie the approach to equilibrium for information theoretic quantities in chaotic systems. Okay? So mostly we'll actually be focusing on the case of systems without conserved quantities, and we'll also discuss a little bit the case with conserved quantities. And while the whole discussion will be in the context of general many-body physics, we can keep in mind an example from black hole physics, where if we consider the following process, where we have some isolated star in a pure state psi 0, and it collapses to form a black hole, and at late times the black hole behaves very much like a thermal state, in particular it emits thermal radiation. Then one aspect of this process which has been discussed a lot is that the combined state of the black hole and radiation at late times is some equilibrated pure state. So in particular, from the formula on the previous slide for the entropy in such a state, the entropies of the black hole and the radiation in the late time state should obey the Page curve.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm sure you mean to do this, but I'm a little confused about the following point, that just when the black hole evaporates, the Hawking radiation, I mean, you seem to not have in mind something like a large black hole in ADS, which just actually corresponds to the thermalized state of a normal field theory after a long time, I mean, approximately. But something that actually evaporates, in which case, you have a cloud of radiation which never really equilibrates. Right? It just is,
so
in some sense, very far from an equilibrium state. Or what is the equilibrium state that this is close to?
So for the purpose of this talk, I want to have either example in mind. Like it could be because I'm interested in this initial state where some stars collapse into form a black hole. But what I mean by this statement here is that while the black hole evaporation process is taking place, it's a very gradual process. And at every step in that process, I can think of the combined state of the black hole and radiation as some thermalized pure state, and the temperature associated with that is the temperature of the Hawking radiation.
What would be the thermal ensemble that is close to, in the sense that you wrote earlier, with an expectation value of simple operators?
Yeah, so the thermal ensemble that it's close to is like e to the minus beta h, where beta is associated with the Hawking temperature.
But if I put flat space at a temperature, it doesn't look like an isolated black hole and a bunch of Hawking radiation outside.
No, I mean the combined state of the black hole and radiation should be thought of as e to the minus beta h, as being similar to e to the minus beta h. So in particular, like if we consider an example like the PSSY model, to be concrete, then there you can see the thermal state as a product of the maximally mixed state, or the infinite temperature state in the black hole path, and some e to the minus beta h. Sorry, it's just a maximally mixed state in the radiation path, So it's the radiation is at internal temperature, and it's tensor with e to the minus beta h for the black hole map.
You said some sort of approximation clearly involved, right?
Yeah.
For example, the
ESS doesn't have dynamical evaporation in it at all. So it's not a good model for this. It doesn't correspond to what you wrote here on the slide.
Right, but somehow we think that what we're calculating using the PSSY model is the late time entropy of some time evolved state.
Yeah, but I was just saying that approximation, for example, is like, because in evaporating black hole, temperature is slightly changing by the time it goes to the page, so it's not a single temperature,
Yeah.
it's not normalized. So if you just apply to the remaining black hole, it's a very good approximation. Otherwise, of course, you have to take into account the temperature is slightly changing and it's not actually interacting anymore, it's a freely propagating.
Right, so this is
And
why
so,
you
of
can keep
course-
the black hole and the radiation at different temperatures.
Yeah,
because
so,
they're
but
not-
with that, of course.
So if I can give you maybe a better example, where the asymptotically flat space thermal ensemble is not even well defined, but in ADS at a low temperature it would be.
It is at a
But
low
at
temperature.
a high temperature, all the black holes, like if I wanted to think of this as a star in ADS that collapses to form a small black hole, let's say, in ADS, so that it can actually then evaporate, as you write here, right? The thermal state, there's no thermal state of CFT that this is at any point even remotely close to. Right, not even at the level of simple operators. That's what my question is.
Unless you denormalize boundary in some way. So of course the imaging is something in the ball, of course. Otherwise,
Right.
on the boundary, of course, it's not a good example.
Right.
I don't know if that can be done, but
Yeah.
that's something you must be imagining.
Right. So,
It
so
probably
the
doesn't matter
setup,
what you're
it's not
gonna
very
do.
important for everyone to do, but I
Yeah.
think the kinds of setups I have in mind were things like, these evaporating black hole models where you have some large black hole in ABS that's made to evaporate by coupling to a bath. And then in that case, there is some well-defined notion of temperature that's associated with the late time state. And essentially, the way that you get some time evolution is just by the fact that degrees of freedom are transferred from the black hole to the radiation. So the definitions of these different subsystems changes. But at every point in time, you can think of the state as being approximately a thermal state. Okay, but in any case, the point that I wanted to make was that we expect that a formula like this is true in the equilibrated pure state. And we have a good understanding of how it comes both from the boundary perspective and from the bulk perspective by including these islands or replica wormholes in the gravity calculation. The approach to equilibrium, which is what I want to focus on today, corresponds to this earlier process where the star is collapsing to form a black hole. And several general things are known about this approach to equilibrium as well. So, in particular, you can consider certain geometries where some star is collapsing to form a black hole, like the Bezier geometry. And using the HRT prescription in this setup, in this paper, it was found that if you start with an initial state with low entanglement and look at the evolution of the entanglement entropy of some subsystem, then for the majority of times, at intermediate times, the entropy has this simple linear growth. So the coefficient of the linear growth in time involves the area of the boundary of the region and the equilibrium entropy density and some order 1 number, which is labeled the entanglement velocity. Okay.
Up to what times is this valid?
This is true for most of the time up to saturation, but not close to the saturation time. There you get. So in 1+1 dimensions, it's true all the way up to saturation time. And for certain configurations at higher dimensions, like you take a strip region, then it's true almost up to the saturation time, but otherwise you get some kind of continuous saturation. But yeah.
So, and the saturation time is determined by the effective temperature?
The
Is it like
saturation
same?
time is determined by the volume of the region.
Mhm.
So when this becomes equal to the equilibrium entropy density times the volume, then it saturates.
So what is entropy is? You
This-
said entanglement is not normal entropy. It's an entanglement.
It's the entanglement entropy.
But entanglement with what? You're just forming a
Yes, I'm
field
considering
state
some.
entanglement.
I'm considering the boundary state that's dual to this regular geometry, and then I'm considering some arbitrary subsystem in that.
Arbitrary subsystem. So it has to be subsystem, right?
Mhm.
The entire thing is secure.
Yeah.
Hawking radiation, anything.
Yeah.
So this is subsystem.
That's right. Yeah. And the saturation time scale is associated with when this entanglement grows to volume for that subsystem. Yeah, so this is the case for some initial state which has a low entanglement entropy between different regions. And then if you consider more general initial states and also try to describe this late time behavior through saturation, then this formula needs to be generalized a bit. And it was shown in these papers that the more general evolution of the entanglement entropy of some subsystem is consistent with the so-called membrane formula, which is something that I'll introduce in the next couple of slides. But this is some generalized version of this formula, which has been proposed in the context of general chaotic systems. And in particular, it should hold in this. It's been shown to hold in the black hole setup. Okay. In this talk, I'll be discussing some general mechanism from which these expressions for the time evolution at late time emerge. One aspect of this that I want to emphasize is the importance of the important role that permutations of different copies of the system will play, not only in the equilibrium values of the nth Renyi entropy, but also in the time evolution. Okay, so, from the perspective of chaotic quantum many-body systems, it's very natural that permutations in the symmetric group on n copies should play an important role in determining the equilibrium value of the nth Renyi entropy. Okay, so an intuitive way of understanding this is that if I write an expression for the time evolution of the nth Renyi entropy, then this is just the exact formula, and it involves some number of u's. It involves n u's and n u daggers. And I can always write this as some path integral on 2n copies of the system, where I have a forward evolution on n copies and a backward evolution on n copies. Okay, so I have some phase factor in the path integral which has this structure. And one thing that I can notice about this is that the exponent in this path integral vanishes in some special set of configurations where each phi I prime is equal to some phi I. Okay, that just follows immediately from the structure of these phases. So it's natural to think of these as some stationary time-independent contributions. And the intuition is that if you have a sufficiently chaotic system and you're considering sufficiently late times, then the remaining part of this path integral should just consist of some large number of rapidly fluctuating phases, which should cancel out at late times. Okay, so this is a very heuristic statement, but in this earlier paper we developed a precise approximation which uses this intuition, and in particular we expressed the nth Renyi entropy of the time-evolved state as a sum of two parts. So the first term P involved a projection onto states associated with some equilibrium density matrix and all possible permutations in the symmetric group. And then the remaining part Q was argued to be some sum of fluctuating phases which should be ignored at very late times. Okay? And one thing that we discussed in this paper was that the different permutations in this sum correspond to precisely different kinds of replica wormhole contributions which describe the equilibrium value of the entanglement entropy in these holographic setups. But now if we want to discuss universal aspects of the approach to equilibrium, then we need to say something more about Q than the fact that it can just be ignored at late times. That's what I'm going to try to do in this talk. And I will argue that at least if we consider local systems in one spatial dimension without any conservation laws, then the universal behavior of this Q term at late times is governed by plane waves of domain walls between permutations. Okay, and if those words don't make sense at this point, that's okay, because my goal in the talk will be to explain what they mean. Okay? So let me quickly review what I mean by this membrane picture of entanglement growth. So this is a general picture for the entanglement growth at late times, which was proposed in this paper. And let me state it explicitly for the case of 1 + 1 dimension, although it's in the case of 1 + 1 dimension, the membrane is just a line, and higher dimensions we have some surface. But the statement is that if I want to find the time involved in entanglement entropy in some subsystem Ly, which is like the entire region to the left of some location y, then I should imagine extending the system in the time direction from t equal to t to t equal to 0. And then consider lines passing through the space-time picture with all possible velocities. And the entanglement entropy at time t will be given by this kind of minimization over all possible such lines. So there are two terms whose sum I'm minimizing. The first term involves linear growth with some coefficient involving some non-trivial function of the velocity, okay, which has this kind of shape. And the second term is just the initial entanglement entropy in the region to the left of y plus vt. So the region to the left of the endpoint of this line. Okay, and the function epsilon v has to satisfy certain general constraints. So in particular, it is this even function with a minimum at v equal to 0. And it also satisfies these constraints, which essentially say that it always lies above the y equal to b line. And there's some value vb at which epsilon v is tangent to the y equal to b line. So it simultaneously satisfies these two conditions.
So is epsilon v a property of the system or a property of the dimension?
It's a property of both. Yeah.
Like, okay,
So it's not the same function in different systems, but what's universal is that it satisfies these constraints.
What's the physical meaning of this epsilon of v?
That is one of the things that I try to address in this talk. So what has been observed is that you can recast a lot of existing calculations of entanglement entropy in this form, including the holographic calculation. So that was done in this paper by Misei. Also the calculations in random unitary circuits. There's some evidence that this also holds in spin chain systems. Good. So if you look at this expression, then if we consider the case where the initial state is just a product state, then the second term is always just 0, because the product state has 0 entanglement entropy between all different regions. So then we would just minimize over different values of epsilon v, so we would always pick the value at v equal to 0, which should then be identified as the entanglement velocity of ve, which I mentioned on the previous slide. But if I have some initial state with some non-trivial profile of entanglement, for instance, if it has volume law entanglement with some coefficient which is between 0 and the equilibrium intensity, then I'll pick some intermediate point on this curve. Okay. Good. So, and I should mention, so this is expected to be true. The calculations that have been done in random circuit models are for the nth any entropies. And in the case of holography, we can only calculate the von Neumann entropy using the RT formula. So in that case, the statement is for the von Neumann entropy. This kind of statement is expected to be true for the von Neumann entropy in general systems, but there's some evidence that it might not be true for the Renyi entropies in systems with some conservation law.
Is there some relation between this picture and the quasi-particle picture?
No, this should be seen as the thing that replaces the quasi-particle picture in natural chaotic systems. And it actually ends up giving the same result if you consider an initial product state and consider the entanglement entropy of just a single region. So if you consider a region like this one, which is all sites to the left of some side, or if you consider a single interval, then you don't see any difference in the results from the quasi-particle or this picture. But if you look at the entanglement entropy of 2 intervals or more, then from the quasi-particle picture, you can have situations where the entanglement entropy doesn't keep growing, but it can have some dip at some intermediate time. But from this picture, you would always see that the entanglement entropy grows, which is expected for chaotic systems.
Thanks.
Is a particle picture correspond to some limit that b equal to 0 or something? Or maybe.
So there is a sort of trivial case with this where you just get a flat membrane tension. So VD is then equal to VE.
That's probably because I'm dominated by second time.
I don't know if that is not really the same as the quasi-particle picture.
But I usually think that if this is kind of
improve the approximation. It kind of contained the previous one as a special case. That's why I'm just
I think they're supposed to describe very different systems, right? So the quasi-particle picture is supposed to hold in certain integral systems, and this is supposed to be a model for generic chaotic systems. So I think there's, yeah, so they're supposed to have just different regimes of it. But yeah, the case where the memory tension is just trivial is seen in 1+1 dimensions in holographic CFTs. And then in higher dimensions you get some non-trivial code. Okay. Good. And then this memory picture is useful not only for understanding entanglement growth, but also for understanding the behavior of OTOCs, at least in systems without conservation laws. So the OTOC is defined as this particular correlation function between some operator at location x about to time t and some other operator w at location y at time 0. And yeah, the motivation for defining this quantity is that it's initially equal to 1 and then it starts to decay at the point where the support of the operator at x grows to the location y. Okay? And the kinds of systems we're considering here are not some SYK or holographic CFT like large N systems, they're just some spin chain systems. So the OTOC doesn't have this Lyapunov form where the initial decay looks like 1 minus e to the lambda t with some Lyapunov exponent. But there's still a well-defined so-called butterfly velocity associated with it, which is that if x and y are two spatially separated locations, then there's some characteristic velocity associated with when the OTOC starts to decay from 1. Okay, so it's expected that, at least in systems without conservation laws, the OTOC should have this kind of expression in terms of the memory tension associated with the second Renyi entropy. Okay, where you get a sum over, so if you have locations x and y is to the right of x, then we should consider all possible j's which lie between x and y, and the velocity vj associated with going from j to y. And the OTOC is given by this kind of sum with epsilon v minus v in the exponent. Okay, so from this expression, so from the general constraints on the memory tension that I mentioned on the previous slide, we know that this quantity is minimized at v equal to vb, and at v equal to vb it's equal to 0. Okay, so that means that if y minus x over t is greater than vb, then in that case vb appears in this sum, and then the value of the OTOC can just be approximated as 1 at late times. And if y minus x over t is less than vb, then vb is not included in this sum, and we would want to select the value of v here, which is closest to vb, which would be this endpoint value of y minus x over t. Okay? So essentially this is correctly capturing the fact that the OTOC should be 1 until a time equal to y minus x over vb. And then it starts to decay. And then you can also see from the conditions on the memory tension that if you expand this expression for v close to vb, then you get essentially, as a result of these conditions on the derivative and so on, you find that the initial decay has this kind of Gaussian form, and there's some kind of width associated with the front of the operator, which grows like square root of t. Okay, so these are all supposed to be universal features of the OTOCs and spin chain models, and they can be reproduced just by using these general constraints on the memory tension. Okay?
And how do you determine J? There's no minimization involved here.
Yeah, right. So there's an implicit minimization because I have a sum like this, and I'm assuming that the time is large.
Okay.
So then, for large times, I just want to pick the minimum of this quantity.
Okay. So that an integral or a sum?
I guess if you have a discrete system, then it's a sum, or
Okay.
whatever. You can think of it as an integral. Okay. Okay, so these are some of the things that we would want to explain, and in particular, the question that we'll ask is, if the memory picture holds universally, then what is the underlying reason for it across a variety of different systems? And in particular, how should this memory intention function be interpreted?
I just had a question about the last formula that you had
Yeah.
on the previous slide. Should it also should it depend on x minus y instead of just x in the last line? Is it x minus
you're
y
right,
minus
that's a typo.
dbt?
Yes. Or y minus x minus vt.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And as t becomes very large, it indeed just decays linearly in time, exponentially. It decays like e to the minus t.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that that is captured by this expression, right? So, so this is supposed to be in the regime where b is still close to bb. So what you see is just starting to decay. And what this is saying is that, so this is going to define some time scale over which the OTOC decays from 1 to 0. And the statement is that the time scale over which that happens is growing like square root of t.
I see. So I should only trust this formula when v and vt are close to each other.
Yeah. But you're right that there is an exponential decay at late times, but you can't see that in this regime.
I see. Okay.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Right, so because this seems to be a useful picture, we want to understand what is the underlying reason for it and how should we interpret this memory intention function. And there was some understanding of this from a paper by Zhou and Hu, where in particular they emphasized that permutations should play an important role. But this was done in the context of models with some circuit structure, and they extensively made use of the discrete structure of the model in order to come up with this interpretation. And somehow what we would like to do is understand how this picture emerges more generally, including in systems like chaotic QFTs, where you can't really make any kind of discrete model for the time evolution. And so to do this, we would want to understand it in terms of some kind of low-lying modes, which could in principle be generalized to the continuum. So that is the kind of picture that I'll try to present here. And another thing that we would like to do is understand the cases where the memory picture breaks down. In particular, it should break down in integrable systems, such as free fermions, and it's also expected not to hold for any entropies in systems with conserved quantities. So we would like to understand some common framework where we can understand the conditions under which this picture emerges and where it doesn't. So in this talk, I'll mostly consider a framework of time-dependent Hamiltonians, which are called Brownian Hamiltonians, and we'll be able to answer these questions in a clear way in that context. Okay, so the plan would be that I'll first discuss some general aspects of these Brownian models, and in particular I'll emphasize how the Lorentzian evolution on multiple copies of the system in such models can be replaced with an emergent Euclidean evolution after some kind of random nitrogen. And then I will discuss in some detail a particular case of this model called the Brownian GUE model, and we'll be able to see the criteria for the emergence of the membrane picture in the setup. And then I'll discuss the generalization to other Brownian models and what happens in cases where the picture breaks down. Okay? Good. So let me start with the general discussion of Brownian models. So the kinds of time-independent Hamiltonians we'll consider, and we'll mostly be restricted to the case of one spatial dimension in this talk. We'll consider time-dependent Hamiltonians which have some choice of local terms H alpha, which we can keep fixed, and then we arbitrarily vary the couplings which appear next to those terms. So these numbers J alpha of t can be taken to be Gaussian IID random variables which are uncorrelated with each other for different alphas and for different t's. Okay? And suppose we choose to discretize our time with some small steps of length epsilon, then the averages of these variables, the average of a single j is always 0. And if we have a product of two j's, then it's non-zero if alpha is equal to alpha prime and t is equal to t prime, and the variance is proportional to 1 over epsilon, which you need to do to properly regularize the time evolution and prevent divergences. Okay, so now for some examples of the kinds of terms we could choose in H alpha are, if we want to consider some general system with no symmetries, then we could take something similar to this mixed field Ising model, which is used a lot in studies of chaotic spin chains. So we can just choose the H alphas to be Zi, Xi, and Zi plus 1 for each side. And we can check that there's nothing except the identity operator that all of these would commute with. Okay? And then if we wanted to consider a model which has some U1 symmetry with a conserved charge equal to the total Xi spin, then we could choose the H alphas to be Zi plus 1 and this combination of the X's and Y's. Okay, and we can check that these commute with this total charge. So the nice thing about these Brownian models is that in principle they should capture a lot of features of generic chaotic evolutions, and as we'll see, the calculations simplify a lot of these models. But the disadvantages are that they could miss some important effects of energy conservation and coherence between different time steps, and we won't be able to do anything about that in this talk. Except that if you consider the case with conserved charges, then you might expect that that captures some effects which are similar to energy conservation in different time steps. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce a sort of general trick which you can use in such models. So one thing that you can always do is if you're considering some correlation function of two operators, then that can be rewritten as a transition amplitude on two copies of the system, with one copy of a forward evolution and one copy of a backward evolution. Okay, and so to do this, we can introduce with each operator on one copy of the system some state on two copies of the system, which is defined in this way. And then this two-point function is just transition amplitude from OX to OY under this time evolution. And then you can do the same thing if you're considering a time-evolved expectation value of some observable in a time-evolved pure state, just with different boundary conditions. Okay. And the nice thing that happens in these Brownian models is that if I consider this time evolution operator and expand it for some small epsilon, then this is just the Taylor expansion for each of the individual terms. But because the average over each of the J alphas was 0, I'll find that when I multiply these things, the linear terms will just vanish. And then the kind of thing that I'll be left with will have the structure of 1 minus epsilon times p for some operator p, which has this explicit form in terms of the H alphas that I chose. So the A and B are supposed to label the two different copies of the system. And I get a Euclidean evolution with some Hamiltonian which lives on two copies and has this particular structure. Okay? And it was important in getting this 1 minus epsilon p that, as opposed to epsilon squared, that the variance was proportional to 1 over epsilon. Anyway, so now when I multiply a series of these small time steps, then I'll just get e to the minus pt for the whole time evolution operator. And this is nice because now I have a Euclidean evolution with some non-negative Hamiltonian. And it's clear that if I want to understand the behavior of these observables at very late times, then all I need to do is understand the behavior of the zero energy subspace of this two-copy Hamiltonian. And if I want to understand the approach to equilibrium at late times, then all I need to understand is the structure of the low energy modes of the two-copy Hamiltonian. Okay? So the zero energy subspace is particularly easy to understand because it essentially, if we go back through these definitions, then we can see that the zero energy subspace of P corresponds exactly to an operator which commutes with each of the H alphas. And those are simply the symmetries of the time evolution. Okay, so in particular, in the case with no symmetries, such as with this choice of the couplings, we can see that the zero energy subspace is one-dimensional and it only contains the state corresponding to the identity operator. And in the case with the U1 symmetry, the subspace is spanned by some ONs, which can be seen as a basis of operators which span the set of symmetries of the Hamiltonian. So in particular, you can choose the ONs to be nth powers of the total z charge, with n going from 0 to n plus 1. Okay? From this we can understand the equilibration of expectation values of operators in the state psi of t, where this e to the minus pt at late times can just be replaced with the projector onto the ground state subspace, and then this late time expectation value is just equal to the expectation value in some thermal state, and the thermal state is just defined using projectors of the initial state onto the different conserved charges. Okay. The case that we're mostly interested in this talk is the case of 4-copy observables, where again you can do something very similar. In particular, the second Renyi entropy in the O2C can be written as transition amplitudes on 4 copies with some other boundary conditions. And for this purpose, we'll have to introduce some states on 4 copies of the system which are associated with an operator O, which lives on 1 copy, and some permutation in the symmetric group on 2 copies. So there are 2 permutations, the identity and the swap. And the state that's associated with the operator O and the identity permutation is given by this kind of product of matrix elements, where each of the i's is supposed to be a basis element for 1 copy of the system. So the state that's associated with the identity operator looks at matrix elements between the A and B and C and D copies. Okay? Yeah.
Can you go back to sides?
2 sides, okay.
Yeah, height goes. It's just order epsilon, right? Being at bottom.
Yeah.
How do you get order epsilon at h squared?
Oh yeah, you mean I have epsilon squared here, so how did I get an epsilon?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So that happens because in each of these terms, I'll calculate an expectation value of this h squared, which will involve
J goes to
j
that
squared.
one. Okay.
And yeah, so it's very important that j is proportional to 2 over epsilon. Okay, good. So yeah, so now we want to repeat this for 4 copies, and we can introduce states associated with an operator and the 2 permutations. And then we can write an expression for the second Renyi entropy, which involves the time evolution on 4 copies. And the initial state is just determined by the actual initial state. And the final state is determined by the pattern of traces in this quantity. So we end up with states associated with different permutations in A and A bar. Okay? And similarly, the OTOC can be written as such a transition amplitude where the initial and final states are associated with the 2 different operators and different permutations. Okay? And now what we want to find is, again, we want to replace this Lorentzian evolution on 4 copies with some Euclidean evolution on 4 copies. And we can do this by using very similar reasoning to what I described for the 2-copy case. And we end up with some super Hamiltonian A, which has this kind of structure, where we have, because we had backward evolutions on the B and D copies, it comes with minus signs on B and D, and forward evolutions on A and C. Okay? So again, if we want to understand the equilibrium value of the entanglement entropy, then we want to understand the structure of the zero energy subspace of A. And again, we can just use the symmetries of the single copy evolution to determine what the zero energy subspace looks like. So in particular, if On and On are 2 operators in the zero energy, 2 operators which commute with the Hamiltonian, then we can define states associated with On, and the identity and swap permutations. Okay? And for generic systems, we should expect that the late time limit of e to the minus at is just the projector onto this subspace. And we can check that this gives exactly the kind of expression we expect for the late time entropy from the equilibrium approximation. So in particular, the late time expression for the purity involves a sum over the entanglement entropy of the equilibrium state in A and the entanglement entropy in A bar. And that leads to a minimization in the secondary entropy between the entropies in A and A bar. Okay? But what we want to understand now is the structure of the low energy modes which lead to the approach to equilibrium at late times. So to do this, I'm going to specialize to a more concrete model where I'm going to make a particular choice of these H alphas, where I just choose them to be, I choose the matrix H alpha itself to be a random matrix, which is drawn from the GUV ensemble and lives on the two sides I and this one. Okay. And then there are some simple rules for how to average such Hamiltonians, and those will lead to a simple Hamiltonian. So for the case of two-copy observables, we get a P which has an extremely simple structure. In particular, it turns out to just be an exactly solvable model with all terms of the Hamiltonian commuting with each other. And you just get a simple gap spectrum which leads to exponential decay of correlation functions, which is what we expect in a model which has no symmetries. So this is not very surprising. In the case of the 4-copy Hamiltonian, we get something which again involves projections onto maximally entangled states between various pairings of the copies, essentially all possible pairings of a forward copy and a backward copy, such as A and B or B and C. And we also get some terms involving swapping the states of A and C or swapping the states of B and D. Okay, so it has some more complicated structure, and in particular, this is no longer an exactly solvable model. But we immediately know from the earlier discussion what its zero energy subspace should look like. Okay, because the only operator which commutes with the time evolution is the identity operator. And so there should be two degenerate ground states corresponding to the two commutations. And it'll be convenient for the rest of the talk to introduce a sort of spin basis for these two commutations. So in particular, I denote an upspin as a state which introduces delta functions between the A and B and C and D copies, and the down state introduces delta functions between the A and D and B and C copies. Okay? So in terms of these variables, the two zero energy eigenstates are just the up state at all sides and the down state at all sides. And I guess just to mention in passing, while this Hamiltonian is not exactly solvable, it can be mapped to so if you consider some orthonormal basis for this and do a Jordan-Wigner transformation, then you can map it to an interacting fermion system called the Kitaev chain. And this particular Hamiltonian always lies on a special line in the phase diagram of this Kitaev chain, which is known to be frustration-free and have two degenerate ground states. Okay? So that is just some discussion of some previous literature on this model.
First question is, suppose you have 4 copies ABCD, I just rename them as ACBD. Does anything change from under the renaming? Is there a meaning to ABCD?
Yeah, sorry. So remember I had some equation which looked like UVIHT as a minus I transpose T. And A and C are both forward-going equations, and B and D are both backward-going.
Okay.
So that is why things are symmetric under pairing A with B, or pairing A with D and B with C, but not under pairing A with C.
And you have a finite number of states, so like if you have a Kitaev chain, there would be a Majorana somewhere, right?
Majorana, yeah, I don't think exactly, and this actually lies within the topological, so the special memory line lies within the topological phase. I think that I'm mostly interested in the thermodynamic limits, so the edge modes don't play an interesting role in this discussion. Yeah, but it would be interesting to see exactly what they imply. Okay. So that was the structure of the ground states, which is fairly simple. But we now want to be able to diagonalize this Hamiltonian in the low energy subspace. And the next couple of slides will involve sort of explicit discussion of how to do that. But hopefully will explain the statement that I made earlier about plane waves of domain walls playing an important role. Okay, so one slightly annoying aspect of this is that the up and down states that I defined are not orthogonal to each other. And so in particular, up and down have a non-zero overlap of 1/q, which makes things a little bit confusing to write down. But it helps to introduce a state up bar and down bar, which obey this kind of orthogonality relation with the actual up and down. Okay? So up bar is orthogonal to down, and down bar is orthogonal to up. And then, so one nice property of this G-Lee Hamiltonian is that if I consider the whole Hilbert space has a dimension of q to the 4 to the power of L, because I'm considering 4 copies of the original system. But I can essentially reduce the dynamics to just the subspace of the up and down spins. So I can reduce the effective dynamics to just a 2 to the L dimensional subspace. And the action of the Hamiltonian is closed within the subspace. Okay, and it's further useful to divide the Hamiltonian into 2 terms, A0 and A1, where A0 has this kind of structure. And in particular, the A0 part turns out to be exactly solvable. And as we can see, A1 is proportional to 1/q squared. So if we take some kind of large q limit, then we can justify first just looking at the A0 part and then doing some perturbation theory around it. Although we have to be slightly careful because these 2 terms end up being individually non-Hermitian. So we just have to be careful about some aspects of the perturbation theory. Okay, so now let's just focus on this A0 part of the Hamiltonian, which consists of these terms. In the expression for the entanglement entropy, the state that I act with on the left is a domain wall state between the up and down spins. So that just followed from the definition of the entanglement entropy, where I took a trace in A bar first and then took a trace in A. So that corresponds to acting with the permutation, the identity permutation in A bar and the swap permutation in A. Okay. So I want to consider the left action on A0 of a domain wall state, and I can check that under the action of this Hamiltonian, this domain wall state transforms in a very simple way, where essentially in the region away from the domain wall, the state doesn't change at all. Because all I need to consider is a term like this in the region with only up spins, and the combination of these 2 terms just implies that if I act with dx on the left, then I just get 0 from the action of any of the AIs which are away from the domain wall. So all I need to consider is the action of A on the domain wall part. And from these terms, I can essentially see that the effect of the Hamiltonian is to either move the domain wall to the left by 1 step, or to move the domain wall to the right by 1 step. Okay? So that I get this very simple action in the domain wall subspace, and then it's very easy to diagonalize this Hamiltonian. And I can see that the eigenstates are just plane waves of the domain walls, and they have some dispersion relation associated with them, which looks like 1 minus 2/q cosine k. Okay, so in particular, because we're taking the large q limit, the spectrum is gapped, and there's some band above the gap of single particle states which correspond to the single domain walls. Okay, and we can now immediately see how an expression like the membrane tension, how an expression like the membrane picture expression comes immediately from this kind of structure. So if we're calculating the entanglement entropy of the region to the left of some side y, then as I mentioned, so this can be written as this kind of transition amplitude between the state associated with the initial state and the final state, which involves a domain wall in y. And for now, we're just approximating the time equation with the A0 part. Okay, so then we can write this single domain wall state in terms of the eigenstates that I just described, just by Fourier transform. And then when we act with the psi k on the left, we get some factor of e to the minus ekt. And eventually, because this kind of overlap again computes the second Renyi entropy of the initial state in the region to the left of y, I eventually end up with an expression with this structure. Okay, so it involves a sum over all possible locations x and a sum over all momenta and this object in the exponent. Okay, so now if I assume that the time is large and x minus y is equal to vt for some order 1 value b, then I can evaluate the integral over k by using some saddle point approximation. And by doing that, I get exactly an expression with this kind of structure, where I've replaced x with the variable b, and the membrane tension that appears here is essentially the Legendre transform of the dispersion equation. Okay. So when I sum this over all b and I consider the limit of late times, then for the second Renyi entropy, this turns into a minimization over all b of the thing in the exponent. Okay. Good. So. Okay. And then with the explicit dispersion relation of 1 minus 2 over q cosine k, we get some explicit expression for the membrane tension function. And we can now check whether it satisfies the constraints that are expected on general grounds. So even though the expression looks complicated, you can check that if you use this constraint as a definition of VB, then VB is just given by 1 minus 1 over q squared. And then we can check that that epsilon b is approximately equal to VB in the large Q limit. So this is all consistent, but we do need some corrections to this away from the large Q limit to satisfy the constraints more generally. And yeah, one aspect of this expression, which is different from the previous expressions in holography and random circuits, is that it has no divergence at b equal to 1, which we should expect because in this kind of Brownian continuous time evolution, there is no circuit structure or no sharp light cone, unlike in the relativistic case. Okay, okay, since there is not a lot of time left, let me very quickly discuss the discussion of the multiple domain wall subspaces. So as we discussed a little bit earlier, it's actually important to consider the evolution of the entanglement entropy for multiple intervals to distinguish between chaotic and integrable systems. And we can also see from this picture how the membrane picture emerges if we look at multiple interval configurations. And the relevant eigenstates for this will be eigenstates which involve multiple domain walls. So you get essentially a product of plane waves of domain walls at different locations. And one of the key things is that the energies associated with the different domain walls just add. Okay? So when we look at this expression, then I guess one subtlety is that this A0 has a term which keeps the number of domain walls fixed, which I'm calling Bf, and a term which can lead domain walls to join together and close, which I'm calling Bc. And if you look at the effect of this term which causes the domain walls to join together and close, then that essentially leads to the saturation of the entanglement entropy. Okay, and we can see this in a clear way by just using the interaction picture for this Bf plus Bc. Okay. But let me now discuss the effect of 1 over q corrections, because if we're saying that the membrane picture is something that should hold universally in a variety of systems, then at the very least it should be robust under including 1 over q corrections in this GUE model. And so now we need to take into account the effect of the A1 term, which I had earlier ignored. And the new thing that happens under the action of this A1 is that while A0 either kept the number of domain walls fixed or decreased it, A1 can take a state from the n domain wall subspace to the n plus 2 domain wall subspace. Okay, so this complicates the picture a little bit. And in particular, the kinds of corrections we need to take into account are from the fact that the original eigenstates psi k in the one domain wall subspace now get some components along the multiple domain wall subspace. And then the perturbed versions of the multiple domain wall eigenstates also have some overlap with the single domain wall subspace. And all the energies get modified, so in principle, there might not be a clean gap between energies associated with one and multiple domain walls. Okay, so when you take into account these different corrections, you get an expression with this kind of structure, where E tilde k are the modified eigenvalues, and psi tilde are the modified eigenstates. And you can now get some contributions from states which in the large Q approximation lie only in the 3-domain wall subspace. So if, with this modified expression, we still want the membrane picture to hold, we need two conditions. One is that there should still be a clean gap between the multiple particle continuum and the single particle eigenstates, so that I can ignore all of these higher terms and I can restrict to just a single particle band. And I should also find that it's still valid somehow to approximate the eigenstates as plane waves of single domain walls as opposed to multiple domain walls, because the picture becomes very complicated if I take into account the corrections from multiple domain walls. Okay, and I will argue that both of these things are true, and if they're true, then we can essentially recover the expression that I had in the large Q limit, and the only real change is that the dispersion relation gets replaced with this modified dispersion relation which takes into account all the one over Q corrections. And the membrane tension is now the Legendre transform of this dispersion relation at finite Q. Okay, so for the assumption that I made about the eigenvalues, that the bands are still well separated, in principle you can compute these things in perturbation theory, but it gets very hard to compute analytically below the lowest order and also doesn't tell you much about finite Q. So we just looked numerically at the dispersion relation for various finite values of Q, and we found that as long as Q is greater than or equal to 3, we get this kind of clean separation between the one particle band and the multi-particle band. Okay, so that condition is satisfied. And one thing worth mentioning is that the membrane tension constraints that I mentioned involving VB, such as epsilon prime of VB is equal to 1 and epsilon VB is equal to VB, translate to a condition on the dispersion relation, which is that the energy evaluated at I log Q should be equal to 0. And this is very hard to check order by order in perturbation theory, but numerically we can check that it's satisfied very well. So this is all consistent. And you can also argue, just by essentially explicit computation, that the eigenvector corrections can also be ignored. And even though in principle you have some overlap with the 3-domain wall subspace, actually there's a clearer description of why you can ignore the eigenvector corrections in terms of the interaction picture, which I'll come to in a couple of slides.
This condition of epsilon is for VB and epsilon prime equal 1 from physically, what was that?
Yeah, good question. So I guess it was clearer where they should come from what I told you about the OTOC expression.
From the beginning, it's kind of thing, like logic or whatever.
Yeah, but you can also see it from the entanglement entropy expression that there should be some velocity. Sorry. So from this expression, we expect that if we started out with an initial state which already had the equilibrium value of the entropy, so if you looked at Ly, then the second term would be Ly times S equilibrium. Then we expect that the entropy of that state should not evolve at all. And the way that you can ensure that is by having some velocity v at which these conditions are simultaneously satisfied. So it's a very natural, it's a physical constraint which should definitely be satisfied from this perspective. And then why this velocity should be exactly the VB which appears in the OTOC is justified by the later discussion, the OTOC expression.
So it's just that's just a check that your model has equilibrium.
that it has equilibrium.
Yeah, because then it has to be.
Yeah, exactly. But phrased in terms of the dispersion relation, it's kind of a weird condition that the dispersion relation evaluated at momentum equal to I log Q is equal to 0.
Yeah, it looks inaccurate, but because
Yeah.
that's the reason.
Yeah.
If your model satisfies that, it should be that.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. Okay. And yeah, so these are just some plots of the actual memory intentions that we get from Legendre transforming the dispersion relations that I showed. So the orange curves are just for the random memory intention, just for comparison, but the blue curves are the actual curves that we get for Q equal to 3 and 4 from the dispersion relation. And in particular, you can see that these curves are tangent to the y equal to v line, which shows that they satisfy these two constraints for some VV. Okay. Good. So, how much longer may I do?
Let's see, maybe a few more minutes?
Okay.
Sounds fine.
Yeah. So the discussion that I had was of the perturbation theory in the Schrodinger picture, and the interpretation of this corrected dispersion relation and so on becomes a bit clearer if you look at the interaction picture. So in the interaction picture, I can, the first order term that I get comes from inserting A1 anywhere in the middle of the evolution. And that has the effect of splitting. So, either I can have a case where my single domain wall doesn't split at all, in which case the evolution is just under A0, or the domain wall can split into 3 at some time t1, okay, which is what this term does. And after it splits into 3, there are two options. One is that 3 domain walls can continue to propagate until time t, or under the effect of this BC part of A0, which can close domain walls, I can have 2 of the 3 domain walls combined together at some intermediate time t2. Okay, so now we can consider the integration over both of these variables t1 and t2 in both of these diagrams, and we can see which regime is actually important and is giving a significant correction. So the region near the t1 equal to 0 endpoint should just give some exponentially suppressed contribution because there are 3 domain walls propagating for most times and those have a much higher energy. But the contribution close to t equal to t1 gives the same kind of contribution as the eigenvector correction in the Schrodinger picture. And here it's easy to see that if the domain walls are only propagating for an order 1 amount of time, then they can only propagate a very short distance. So the memory picture is essentially unchanged. And then in this second diagram, if you consider the regime where the 2 times are very far from each other, then again that contribution is exponentially suppressed because we have 3 domain walls propagating for a large amount of time. But the only important corrections are the ones where this T2 is some order 1 time after T1. Okay, so these are not exponentially suppressed in anything. And in principle, we need to resum all such corrections. And we can check that they correspond exactly to a resummation of the... when you resum all of these, it gives you exactly a correction to the energy dispersion. Okay, so that is a sort of more physical understanding of what is being resummed. Okay, and if we now consider the case of more general Brownian models where we don't take the H alphas to be random G matrices, then we can imagine, or we can give a precise criteria for when the memory picture should emerge in such models and when it should not. So essentially we can always divide these general Hamiltonians A associated with these evolutions into a part which keeps us within the subspace of permutations and a part which is closed within the subspace orthogonal to the permutation subspace, and then something which takes us between the permutation and the non-permutation subspace. A somewhat non-trivial fact, which didn't have to be true but turns out to be true, is that for arbitrary choices of the H alphas, this part which is projected onto the permutation subspace is always proportional to the GUE expression. But anyway, so the reasoning here is that that the eigenstates of that for all such models we have two degenerate eigenstates, one corresponding with all up states and one corresponding with all down states. So the eigenstates of the Hamiltonian within the permutation subspace correspond to some number of domain walls. And so we expect that they locally look like ground states, so their energies should scale only with the number of domain walls, which can be some order 1 number. Whereas in the orthogonal subspace, the state doesn't look like a ground state anywhere, so generically the energies should be extensive. Okay, based on that, a natural guess is that in all such models, if we just look at the single particle band of low energy excitations, then it should still resemble plane waves of domain walls, and it should be gapped, and then the dispersion relation above the gap should again be related to the memory tension in such models. So this is something that we need to check numerically, and it's a little bit harder to do just because the Hilbert space dimension at each site is now much larger. For general values of Q, even for Q equal to 2, the Hilbert space at each site is 8-dimensional. So we need some more sophisticated matrix product techniques to try to probe the one particle band. But the expectation is that in all cases where you do find this gap in some well-defined single particle band, there should be a memory picture. But this should break down in cases where the model is integrable, such as, for instance, if you happen to choose the H alphas to be Zi and xi plus 1, then you can rewrite that using the Jordan-Wigner transformation as a free fermion model, which is definitely integrable and not chaotic. And you can check that in that specific case, as was discussed in this paper. The Hamiltonian associated with that ends up being just the ferromagnetic Heisenberg model, and it has gapless dispersion. And you can check that as a result of that, the growth of the entanglement entropy is like square root of t instead of linear. Okay. So, and then maybe I can very briefly mention that in the case with the U1 conservation law, in general, the conservation law leads to a degenerate ground state subspace. And if you just look at the 2-copy Hamiltonian, then that just turns out to be the ferromagnetic Heisenberg model again, and its low energy eigenstates are spin waves with some k-squared dispersion relation. And that explains the diffusive behavior of 2-point functions in a very simple way. And the 4-copy Hamiltonian is more complicated, but again, it has gapless modes, so this membrane picture should be modified. And we're able to see numerically that the entanglement growth changes from linear to square root of t at late times. And the square root of t behavior is coming from the low energy modes in this, of this A Hamiltonian. And this should be understood in a more explicit way. But that's what I wanted to say. And I guess this is the summary, which maybe we read.
Looking at the calculations, there is some sort of similar flavor to RTN calculations, particularly to random test network calculations, where the way you assign spins is very similar. In that.
Yeah, it comes from the same kind of random averaging.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And the map, I'm talking about specifically the map to spin sort of model, right? Except that you're kind of turning it around in short spaces that it's in time. I was wondering whether it's like any deeper correction or is it just random averaging all the way does this?
I think that it's just both are a consequence of random averaging, and the intuition for choosing random matrices in both cases is that in chaotic systems, you expect that the time evolution operator is some very complicated operator, so you can essentially treat it like a random operator. And in the case of these random tensor networks, you expect that the bulk-to-boundary map in holography is some very complicated map, and so that's the reason there. I guess there might be some relation between the fact that the boundary evolution in holographic systems is chaotic, and the bulk-to-boundary map is a very complicated map.
Yeah.
So to that extent, yes.
Do you have any ideas about how similar stuff could show up in systems without averaging?
So I think, yeah, that's a really good question. And so we definitely expect that results like this one, like if you look at this, should be true in models without random averaging. And one way that you could imagine that happening is if you, so now you don't have eternized PT, but you can always write the time evolution operator in the energy eigenbases. And then you get some sum over large numbers of phases involving the energy eigenstates. And so you say at late times, you essentially just pair the energy eigenstates together so that you get a stationary contribution. But as you're approaching late times, it's maybe intuitive that if you have such a sum over random phases, then that would have some kind of characteristic decay with the time, and that could
should
be
presumably just come from. Well, but it's not. It's not like universal random matrix physics that's going to control this sort of stuff, right? So.
Yeah, right. So if I expanded this in the energy eigenbases, then I would get some factor involving the eigenstates and some factor involving just phases, e to the I. And if I assume that those factors are completely uncorrelated with each other, then the factor involving the energy eigenstates just becomes a spectral form factor.
Yeah, but it's the early time spectral form factor.
Yeah. But even the early time spectral form factor is supposed to not be governed by like the same kind of physics as these correlation functions. At least it's not obvious that that just knowing the value of the spectral form factor and its decay with time is enough to describe the evolution of these observables. So, but it's definitely not the late time.
I guess there's one question of within a given system, is it the same physics that controls the spectral form factor and the correlation functions and gradient entropy and so on, like all the physics of scrambling, but then there's another question of how universal is that physics, how was the...
I guess we independently expect that the physics associated with scrambling and gradient entropies is universal. But we expect having scrambling is universal, but I'm not sure how confident we are in the details of how that scrambling happens. But I guess one example of the universality is that there's some kind of membrane picture or some kind of
I mean, sure, like the membrane picture, if the membrane picture is pretty universal, then that's a pretty strong, that's large aspects that are universal, but I'm wondering if you can connect it to other things that we expect to be universal, or like, I don't know.
So if you make...
Like why we should expect that beyond it seems to work quite well, and wide variety of cases.
Right. But I still think that, if you consider the case of 4-copy observables, like the secondary entropy of the ODOC, then if you make such assumptions about the factor involving the eigenvalues being uncorrelated with the factor involving the eigenstates, then that would tell you that the 4-point function should be controlled by essentially like the spectral form factor squared. Which I think we expect is not true, because the physics that's encoded in 4-point functions is much richer than the kind of physics that's encoded in 2-point functions, which is essentially like the spectral form factor. So I think a step towards understanding the case without random averaging would be better understanding the case with the U1 conservation law, because in both cases you expect that there's equilibration to finite temperature, and the U1 conservation law plays some complicating role which is similar to the role of energy conservation. And even here, like, I would have wanted to say, for instance, that the eigenstates which govern the late time evolution are essentially just plane waves of like e to the minus mu q and the identity permutation in one region and some domain between that and e to the minus mu q and the swap permutation in the other regions. But that turns out to be too simple, so there's something more complicated going on in these models. Yeah, maybe once we understand that can be a step towards understanding electrical evolution.
Any other questions? Let's thank Shrey again.